In 1674, workers demolishing a staircase in the Tower of London found a wooden chest buried 10 feet underground. Inside were the skeletons of 2 children. They had been hidden there for nearly 200 years, and to this day, no one knows exactly who put them there, or how those children died. This is the story of the princes in the tower, and it is one of the oldest unsolved murders in human history. To understand how 2 royal boys vanished from one of the most heavily guarded fortresses in England, you need to understand the world they were born into, a world where the crown was not inherited. It was seized. The year is 1483. England has been tearing itself apart for nearly 30 years in a dynastic civil war we now call the Wars of the Roses. The House of York and the House of Lancaster have been locked in a brutal cycle of betrayal, battle, and bloodshed over who has the rightful claim to the English throne. Kings have been deposed. Kings have been murdered. Loyalty is a currency that changes hands faster than coin. On April 9, 1483, King Edward IV dies suddenly at the age of 40. He leaves behind 2 sons, Edward, Prince of Wales, who was just 12 years old, and Richard, Duke of York, who was 9. By every law and custom, 12-year-old Edward is now King Edward V of England. But Edward IV also leaves behind a brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. And before his body is even cold, Richard moves with breathtaking speed. He intercepts young Edward on the road to London, dismisses the boy's maternal guardians, and installs himself as Lord Protector of the realm. Within weeks, both princes are lodged in the Tower of London, which, at the time, served as both a royal residence and a prison. At first, this doesn't seem unusual. English monarchs traditionally stayed in the Tower before their coronation. A date is even set, June 22, 1483. But that coronation never happens. And what Richard does next changes everything. But here's where it gets strange. In June of 1483, a clergyman named Ralph Shaw delivers a public sermon at St. Paul's Cross in London, declaring that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was illegitimate, making both princes bastards with no claim to the throne. Parliament agrees. On June 26, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is proclaimed King Richard III. The 2 boys, now declared illegitimate, remain in the Tower. Witnesses report seeing them playing in the Tower grounds in the early weeks of that summer. But as the weeks pass, the sightings grow fewer. And then, silence. By autumn of 1483, no one reports seeing either prince alive. They simply disappear. Now, let me ask you something. If you were living in 1483 and 2 royal children vanished from the most secure building in England, a fortress staffed by the king's own men, who would you suspect? The most obvious answer is Richard III himself. He had the means, the motive, and the access. With both princes dead, his claim to the throne becomes virtually unchallengeable. The contemporary historian Dominic Mancini, writing in late 1483, noted that the prince's attendants had been gradually withdrawn and that the boys were seen less and less frequently, quote, like victims awaiting sacrifice. That is a primary source written within months of their disappearance. But there's a problem with pinning it all on Richard. The primary account that names him directly, Sir Thomas More's History of King Richard III, was written nearly 30 years after the events, around 1513. More claims that Richard ordered a man named Sir James Tyrrell to smother the boys in their beds, and that Tyrrell later confessed. But Tyrrell's so-called confession was extracted under torture before his execution in 1502 for an unrelated act of treason, and the original text of that confession has never been found. We are trusting a second-hand account of a coerced confession recorded decades later by a man who was 7 years old when the princes disappeared. What would you have done with that evidence in a court of law? So let's look at the other suspects. Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII, defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August 1485 and took the throne. Henry had every reason to want the princes dead. As long as Edward V and his brother lived, they represented a rival Yorkist claim that could destabilize his reign. And here's an uncomfortable detail: when Henry VII took the Tower, he never launched a public investigation into the prince's fate. He never produced their bodies. He never even formally accused Richard III of their murder. For a man who built his entire reign on delegitimizing Richard, that silence is deafening. Then there's Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham was Richard III's closest ally during the power grab of 1483. He had access to the Tower. He had his own distant claim to the throne through Thomas of Woodstock. And in October 1483, just months after the princes vanished, Buckingham launched a rebellion against Richard. Some historians believe Buckingham may have killed the boys on his own initiative, either to ingratiate himself with Richard or to clear his own path to power. When the rebellion failed, Richard had Buckingham executed. Dead men tell no tales. Now, let's go back to those bones. In 1674, workmen found the remains of 2 children beneath a staircase in the White Tower, exactly where Thomas More said the boys had been buried and then moved from. King Charles II ordered the bones placed in an urn in Westminster Abbey, where they remain today. In 1933, the bones were briefly examined. The analysis suggested they belonged to 2 children aged roughly 10 and 12, consistent with the prince's ages. But the examination was conducted with 1930s-era technology. No DNA testing was performed. Multiple requests to re-examine the bones using modern forensic methods, including DNA analysis that could compare them to known relatives, have been denied by Westminster Abbey in the Church of England. The last formal request was rejected in 2013. The bones that might solve a 540-year-old murder sit in a marble urn, untouched, in one of the most visited churches on earth. And no one is allowed to open it. So where does that leave us? Over 5 centuries later, we have a missing pair of children, a usurping uncle, a conquering rival king, a treacherous duke, a coerced confession, a set of bones no one will test, and a silence that has outlasted every dynasty that had a reason to keep it. Richard III's own remains were discovered under a parking lot in Leicester in 2012, and DNA confirmed his identity. We have the science. We have the technology. We could, in theory, answer the question that has haunted English history since the summer of 1483. But here's the real question, and I want you to think about this. What if the bones in Westminster Abbey don't belong to the princes at all? What if the answer isn't in that urn? What if Edward and Richard survived, smuggled out of the Tower by a sympathetic guard, raised under false names, their identities erased to protect them? At least 2 pretenders claim to be the younger prince in the years after 1485. One of them, Perkin Warbeck, was so convincing that multiple European courts recognized him as Richard, Duke of York. Henry VII had him executed in 1499. Was Warbeck a fraud? Or was he the last prince, silenced by yet another king who couldn't afford the truth? We may never know. And maybe that's the point. Power doesn't just kill people, it buries the evidence. And sometimes, it buries it so deep that even 500 years of digging can't reach it. What do you think happened to the princes? Tell me in the comments. If this case kept you up at night, subscribe to Obscura Files. We dig into the darkest corners of history, the cases that were never closed, the questions that were never answered, and the truths that someone, somewhere, wanted to stay buried. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next investigation. Until then, stay curious. Stay suspicious. And remember, history is written by the survivors.